Hello again, this is Alister McGrath at Oxford University. And we're now going to begin to look at the whole idea of explanation in science and religion. And as you remember, in the last presentation, we looked very briefly at the ideas of the British philosopher Mary Midgley about how we can, in effect, hold together multiple insights on a complex reality without distorting it. In other words, how can we avoid aggressive reductionism? Let's agree, I think, that science tries to make as much sense of our world as possible using as few assumptions as possible, but that's not the same as forcing reality into preconceived molds. So let's begin by thinking about what it means to explain something. For example, an observation of the world around us. I think it's one of the most distinctive features of human nature, which is that we try to make sense of the strange and puzzling world that we see around us. We try to find ways of explaining it and representing it. And if you like, there seems to be some kind of fundamental instinct on our part to want to make sense of our world and also ourselves. And I often think that this human fascination with making sense of our world may help us to understand why we like detective novels or TV crime thrillers so much. Now, in the late 20th century, two main approaches to scientific explanation emerged. I'm going to tell you about them. They're now generally described as ontic and epistemic. Again, ontic and epistemic. Don't be frightened by the terms. I'm going to explain what they mean to them. So let's begin by thinking about the ontic account. This distinction between ontic and epistemic approaches to explanation goes back to Wesley Salmon, a well-known philosopher of science. And Wesley Salmon suggests that ontic accounts of explanation hold that explanation is basically about identifying structures and processes within the world which cause phenomena to take place. In other words, it's about causes within the natural order. So if A causes B, then A explains B. Explanation is thus about identifying the cause of events within nature. Now, of course, some events will have multiple causes, so the explanation is going to be rather complex, but nevertheless, the basic idea is that explanation is about identifying structures in the world which give rise to the observations that we see. So let's think now about epistemic approaches. Epistemic approaches are rather different. They are, if you like, not so much looking at the world, but looking at ourselves and looking at the mental frameworks that we generate in order to organize and make sense of empirical observations. In other words, explanation is about us as human beings creating mental links within our minds between observations of the world. If you like, we're throwing a mental map over what we observe. We develop a framework within our minds to link together and hold together the observations that we see outside us. So to explain something is really to see how it fits into a bigger picture. We create a big picture and we fit our observations into it. But the point is, we don't observe this big picture. We observe other things and then infer the existence of this big picture, which makes sense of this and observations in addition to this. So if you like, observations exist, but explanatory frameworks are created. So let's look at a famous example which may help us just to make sense of this. This is Isaac Newton's very famous demonstration that the orbits of the planets around the sun and the motions of objects to the surface of the Earth are actually due to the same force of gravity and obey the same laws of motion. In other words, they're all part of the same big picture. You might think here of the very famous story of Newton watching an apple falling off a tree in his mother's garden during the 1660s and making a connection with this bigger picture. Now again, here's the point to appreciate. Two seemingly different observations, apples falling to the ground, planets orbiting the sun. These seemingly different observations are both examples of the same principle. They're both due to gravity, the curious and rather counterintuitive idea that mass attracts mass. Now, back in the 17th century, this idea seemed very, very strange, and Newton actually had misgivings about it. But actually, once you proposed this idea, it allowed a wide range of apparently disconnected observations to be seen as aspects of a single big picture. And the point is that proposing something could not be observed made sense of what could be observed. So let me summarize. Ontic approaches to scientific explanation appeal to something beyond the observer, located in the structures of the world. Whereas epistemic approaches locate explanation in the conceptual structures that we generate within us. They're in our minds. So epistemic explanation is about creating a mental image or picture to make sense of what we observe. Now, as I'm sure you've guessed by this point, these are not incompatible. There's a lot of overlap between them. They may be distinguishable, but they're often inseparable. I think that's a very important point to make. Now, we do need to ask about the limits of explanation, because this is a very important point in thinking about the relationship of science and faith. And in a recent discussion of the explanatory capacities of the natural scientists, the physicist Steven Weinberg remarked, and I quote, "We will never be able to explain our most fundamental scientific principles." Now, that may strike you as being rather pessimistic, rather strange, but actually I think he's right. He argues we can certainly hope to develop a set of simple universal laws of nature. That's one thing. And those laws are very, very helpful in understanding how our world functions. But here's the point that Weinberg is making. Weinberg is arguing that if we try to go deeper and ask why it is this set of laws of nature that apply in our universe and not a different set of laws, well, we just can't explain it. That's the way things are. They're just there, and we have to get used to that. So I guess you're asking, how does religious faith come into this? Well, the philosopher Richard Swinburne argues that God is the best explanation for the complex patterns of phenomena that we observe in the natural world. Here's what he writes. See if you can make sense of this. "I am postulating a God to explain what science explains. I do not deny that science explains, but I postulate God to explain why science explains." To see his point, explanation itself needs explanation. The fact that we can explain the world is actually quite strange. And Swinburne argues that the existence of God helps us to explain why we can explain things in the first place. Now, I think that's a very important point, and I will come back to that. Albert Einstein made a very similar point, that the most astonishing feature of our universe is the fact we can explain it. Why? Well, Swinburne provides us with his own answer. But he's not, of course, arguing this is why everyone comes to faith in God. He's rather arguing that Christianity makes sense of human experience as a whole and uses criteria similar to those used in other approaches to explanation, such as that we find in the natural sciences. Now, we'll look at this in more detail later. But we need now to think of another question. And we've talked a bit about what explanation is. So how do we identify possible explanations for our observations? It's a really interesting question, and in the next presentation I'm going to look at the whole question of how we generate explanations in the first place. Thank you so much for listening. I look forward to speaking to you again very soon.